In the face of America's war economy and militarism, I believe, and many others, that nonviolent moral dissent, nonviolent moral resistance, and nonviolent moral visions and actions and dreams are a necessity today, just as they were in yesteryear. I come here today to speak, yes, even preach, on a subject that cannot be ignored if we are truly concerned about a more perfect union and the establishment of justice. Cannot be ignored. If we are concerned about moral injury and the deepest moral foundations of the faith that calls us to embrace and prophetically imagine and promote an agenda of love, of truth, justice, care for the immigrant, the poor, and the least of these. I come here today to speak on a subject that cannot be ignored if we truly are concerned about this democracy and the world. Martin Luther King Jr. taught, and we know, that if every decision is shaped by a nation's commitment to a philosophy and ideology that privileges militarism, that nation sows its own demise. Dr. King courageously said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Almost 51 years later, it's still true. I come here to address today what General Eisenhower, a general in the Army, a Republican, a retired 5-year Army general, the man who led the Allies on D-Day, said when he made his remarks in his farewell speech in 1961. He said to us, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. And originally he said the congressional military-industrial complex. He said then that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, and we must remember that today. I've come today to address what we must address, and that is how the war economy and militarism connect to what we in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, and repairers of the breach call 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, as seen through the lens of voter suppression, attacks on immigrants, the continuing legacy and oppression of indigenous First Nation Indians, resegregation of schools, mass incarceration, Islamophobia, xenophobia, systemic poverty of over 140 million poor and low-wealth citizens, among which more than 60 million are white, ecological devastation, and our distorted religious nationalism, what Dr. C. Eric Lincoln once called Americanity. The truth is, if you are going to address these other 4, you have to address the issue of the war economy and militarism. But I also need you to know I come today as a pastor of more than 26 years of a church congregation in a military town. a military base town. I have to soothe and console the members of my church and community when their loved ones go off to war and when they have deep questions about why. I have to pastor people who have been affected by every war since World War I. I've had to bury family members who came back in flag-draped caskets from war, or who are sick today and dying from the impact of war, who have great questions about whether even the war was necessary in the first place. I must minister to those among the hundreds of thousands who come back alive, but scarred mentally and physically forever from war. But I'm also the son of a World War II Navy veteran who was drafted as a college student at Elizabeth City State University into a segregated Navy, a valedictorian, a man that would go on to earn 2 master's degrees, become a clergy person and work on his doctorate degree. But when he was drafted into a segregated Navy, asked to give first-class blood for second-class citizenship. He was asked to go and fight for the world's safety against Hitler, and yet to still suffer because of white supremacy in America. And because he was black, he had to suffer the indignity of riding in the back of the train while German war veterans rode in the front. I'm the grandson of a man who fought in World War I, who served in the military and was among those threatened when they came back home in a land where black men, when he came back home from World War I, were being hung on an average of 1 per day in the early 1900s. And black soldiers faced riots of white supremacists who sought to put them in their place. And yet I come with no hatred toward this country, but with a prayerful commitment to be among those who love her enough to be real, the real kind of patriots that dare to tell her the truth, and to join with others who would dare to tell her the truth. Now, I don't come proposing to know everything. I don't come naive enough to think that we do not have real dangers in this world. But I do come today from all those different directions, and even remembering the words of my father who was in war, who still knew that ultimately war was not the answer. I come asking with my brother Marvin Gaye, as the U.S. spends more and more on war and militarism, what's going on? And especially now, as we have a president fueled by narcissism, will get mad and lose his temper at anything, will even criticize dead senators and warriors. And even as the hounds of war are lining up and filling up the top advisory roles, a president who not too long ago dropped illegal bombs on Syria that in no way met the standards laid down in the Joint War Powers Resolution. What's going on? The first question is not even about the wrongness in Syria, but the War Powers Resolution that was designed to interpret the purpose of our Constitution and to ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States Armed Forces into hostilities. It is in that place that it says that the constitutional powers of the Commander-in-Chief to introduce the United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, specific statutory authorization, and 3, a national emergency created by an attack upon the U.S., its territories, or its armed forces. This means that the president can order troops without a congressional declaration and without authorization for the use of the military only if there is an attack on the U.S. territory or U.S. troops or U.S. territory or possessions, which means we have dropped illegal bombs. And we can never surrender that power to one man or one office alone. Just weeks ago, Congress voted for the first time to invoke the War Powers Act to stop U.S. complicity in the horrifying Saudi war against Yemen. But we must be prepared to challenge a threatened presidential veto. We must declare that moral dissent and moral resistance and moral vision cannot in any way dismiss the violence of any country or leader. And we must challenge the war economy and militarism here in America, because as we sit here today, there are enough nuclear weapons, some say in this country alone, surely in the world, to destroy life on earth between 5 to 50 times. So many that experts can't even agree. But the bottom line is the world's nuclear arsenal and our own are so powerful that we could destroy the earth many times over. The U.S. spent more money on military than the next 7 countries combined. And those are China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Russian Federation, India, France, and the UK and Japan. We spent nearly 3 times as much as China and 9 times as much as Russia. Our military spending was 26% of the world's total. The United States now has some 800 bases in foreign countries, 70 years after World War II and 62 years after the Korean War. We have to know if this is left unchecked and unchallenged, America will continue to be, as Dr. King once said, the greatest purveyor of violence the world has ever known. Now, I'm a preacher. The Bible says in Mark chapter 5 that Jesus got on a boat and crossed over to a country of Gadarenes, and he met a madman from a cemetery that came upon him. He couldn't be chained, he couldn't be tied down. He had been tied up so many times with many chains, night and day. He rolled through the lowlands of the graves and the hills. Jesus saw him a ways off, and he ran to pray before Jesus. He asked Jesus, what business did Jesus have with him? And he said, I don't want you to give me a hard time. And Jesus did something interesting. He asked this man, tell me your name. Tell me your name. The man replied, my name is Legion. And then he desperately begged Jesus not to banish him from the country. A large herd of pigs were rooting on a nearby hill. The demon begged them, send us into the pigs so that we can live. Jesus gave the order, but then the pigs ran off the side of the hill, and everyone came out to see what had happened. And they came up to Jesus and saw this madman sitting there wearing decent clothing, no longer in the graveyard, but up higher. And those who saw it told others. And first they were in awe, but then they got upset. They were upset over losing their money. They were more upset over losing their money than they were about this man being healed, and they demanded that Jesus go and never come back again. You need to know that this text in Mark's gospel is about the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. It was a place that was settled by many veterans of the Roman army, veterans that conquered lands as payment for their service. This story in the Bible is about confronting imperial militarism. Mark's description of this demonic pain is detailed, and it is powerfully powerful. We should be mindful that this sort of agony has long captured the imagination of artists and poets, as well as psychologists and political reformers who have tried to describe the condition of human oppression. Mark clearly characterizes this man who represents the culture, who represents the people, as a victim. He's a victim of militarism. He's a victim of military occupation, because he says, my name is Legion, for we are many. And that Latin term had only one meaning, a division of Roman soldiers 4 such legions were based in Syria to control at that time the eastern frontier, including Jewish Palestine. We need to understand that this text is trying to say to us that an overcommitment to militarism and war will literally drive us down into the graveyard of life as a nation. It is trying to say that the whole demonic structural complex of militarism can create a situation where we no longer know our names or our purposes, but every decision is driven by military might and conquering and the war economy, rather than what's right and what should be done to save humanity. We must wrestle with how historically the legions down through the years have held us as a nation into the low places. 50 years ago, the U.S. was mired in a brutal, unwinnable war thousands of miles away. The war in Vietnam was a classic rich man's war, fought by and between poor people, mostly poor American soldiers, backed by poor South Vietnamese troops, fighting against even poorer South Vietnamese nationalist guerrillas and North Vietnamese troops. The poor people who met in the muddy tents in Washington, D.C.'s Resurrection City in the summer of 1968 were the people whose sons and daughters, uncles and brothers had been drafted and sent to fight in the jungles of Vietnam. So focusing on militarism as a key component of the Poor People's Campaign back then was all about the movement, recognizing the connections. Challenging militarism as a necessary component of a moral revival in our nation was new to some in that first movement, but not to all. See, there was a legal draft then that made all young men theoretically vulnerable to being drafted, theoretically. Willing or not, the draft made the military somewhat more democratic. All young men had to register by their 18th birthday. All knew they might be sent to Vietnam. But the draft didn't affect everybody the same. The wealthier boys and those tracked in high achievement high school classes looked forward to college deferments, which if they planned it right could keep them out of the military altogether. That is where racism and poverty came in, because the young men who weren't wealthy and didn't get tracked into college prep courses were disproportionately black, Latino, and poor whites. So they were the ones disproportionately drafted, disproportionately served in the front line combat units, and were disproportionately killed. The war in Vietnam reflected the militarism that had infected our whole society in the context of the Cold War. And unless we understand its history then, we cannot understand our reality now. We were told that Vietnam was a domino, and if it fell, all of South Asia would fall next, and soon the communists would invade San Diego. Only war, we were told, could protect us from such a fate. And if it meant 58,000 young American troops had to die, and if the 2 million or more Vietnamese, Cambodians, and others had to die, that was just the price of freedom. We didn't hear much about the origins of the war in Vietnam. And I don't mean only the specific origins, like the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorizing troops to be deployed in Vietnam, which we now know was based on lies. I'm talking about the broader origins, that Vietnam was fighting a war against French colonialism, and when the French were finally defeated, our government agreed to take up the military fight to protect the pro-Western proxy government in South Vietnam. We didn't hear much about that, but Mother Coretta Scott King, who was right on the war before Dr. King. Coretta Scott King was right on the war before Dr. King. She led him, and she spoke 3 weeks after his death, and she said this: "I was looking among the notes in my husband's pockets when he was shot, and I saw parts of a speech that he never delivered. Perhaps they were his early thoughts for the message he was going to give to you today." And she said, and I quote, "These are Martin's 10 commandments on Vietnam. 1, thou shalt not believe in a military victory. 2, thou shalt not believe in a political victory. 3, thou shalt not believe that they, the Vietnamese, love us. 4, thou shalt not believe that the government has the support of the people. 5, thou shalt not believe that the majority of South Vietnamese look upon the Viet Cong as terrorists. 6, thou shalt not believe that the figures of killed enemies or believe the figures of killed enemies or killed Americans. Number 7, thou shalt not believe that the generals know best. Number 8, thou shalt not believe that the enemy's victory means communism. 9, thou shalt not believe that the world supports the United States. And 10, thou shalt not kill. These were Martin King's 10 commandments on Vietnam, Coretta said. And it was on April 4, 1967, she said that my husband gave his major address against the war in Vietnam. On April 4, 1968, he was assassinated. Do you hear what I just said? Exactly 1 year from the day that he stood in New York in Riverside Church and dared to challenge militarism. He was killed. She said, I remember how he agonized over the grave misunderstanding which took place as a result of his position on the Vietnam War. Coretta and Martin tried to warn America. Along with other groups, they tried to warn America, but instead, when Dr. King preached the truth in this city, civil rights organizations left him. Churches left him. Some of his own staff left him. Labor unions left him. Preachers left him. They said they were wrong. But history has proven he and Coretta were right. We lost that war. We didn't lose it because the media held back our troops or because politicians didn't allow the generals to use all their potential power. We lost because the Vietnamese were fighting for something they believed in, while on our side, however, our brave individual soldiers, they were fighting as foreign invaders on someone else's land, and it was an unwinnable war. And today, the daughters and sons of many of our core supporters of the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, are in the military still. Today, we don't have a legal draft. And we hear a lot about an all-voluntary military, except it isn't really voluntary at all. It's made up of a poverty draft, a no other job draft, a no money for college draft, and sometimes a no other way to get my family health care draft. So these days, the disproportionality of the military isn't by race, it's by poverty and by the rural and urban divide. The military is disproportionately made up of poor young people, men and women, disproportionate from rural areas and small towns. And one effect of that is that most journalists writing or broadcasting in the mainstream national press don't even know those in the military, because they come from places outside of where the military really reports. So they don't even know often how to talk about it, and very often they just don't. All we hear is thank you for your service. And that's a huge problem, because today, like in 1968, the U.S. is again fighting a still brutal, still unwinnable war. And this time it's almost 18 years old. The longest war in our nation's history is in Afghanistan. At this moment, the number of troops is significantly smaller than at the height of the U.S. and U.S.-backed occupation that saw more than 200,000 troops in place at one time, but there are still thousands of U.S. troops fighting, killing, and sometimes dying, though rarely these days, in that faraway war. U.S. political and military leaders during the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations from both political parties and all parts of government have repeatedly told us there is no military solution. They say it is for Iraq and Syria and Libya and other countries too. And nonetheless, we continue to send troops and special forces and bombers and armed drones and more. Their militarized action gives lie to their realistic words. What was true in 1968 remains true today. Any nation, we are not an exception, any nation that lives by the sword will ultimately die by the sword. And what was clear to those of the first Poor People's Campaign in 1968 remains a powerful understanding for us today. Militarism as an evil reality that has held the center of our nation hostage since the founding of this country. Ours is a country, and I have no joy saying this, founded on two evils: the genocide of indigenous populations who lived in this land since time immemorial, and the enslavement of Africans brought to this country in chains. And the blood of both run through my veins, and the blood of the oppressor. Both of these realities were enabled by superior military power. Guns that won out over arrows, whips and chains and nooses that won out over stolen lives. And both of those realities provided this country with the land and the water that had once belonged to others, and with the value of the labor of people forced to work for the enrichment of others for over 250 years. And then another 100 years of Jim Crow. Those realities made this country, or at least made the elites within the country, made them richer and more powerful than any other country in history. No other country. America is among the youngest of nations. There's no way in the world it could have outdistanced other nations older than this country by thousands of years sometime without the genocide of indigenous people and the stealing of their land and free labor. And not to tell this truth is to live the American lie and to ever be bound by its distortions. It is never enough just to remember the evils of the past, however, for we know from our great teacher, Howard Zinn, that there are two narratives in our country, and that we need to keep both of them simultaneously in our minds and in our hearts. The first is the painful reality that genocide and slavery are central to our country's history. But there's a second narrative, always a second remnant, and that is the crucial reality that our country has also been a country of powerful people's movements rising up against slavery, against genocide, with moral dissent, moral vision, and moral resistance. So if we are serious about changing the present, we need to understand how the past came to be, and how the legacies, both the legacies of genocide and slavery and the legacies of the movement against those evils, remain with us today. Militarism has been a part of our nation from its founding. We sit here today, we stand here today on land that once belonged to other folk. To Matin, the natives, the Matsfet, the tribes, the native people, the Matincock native people lived in much of what is now called Queens before militarized white colonization took their land. The myth of manifest destiny gave religious cover to what sometimes was only slight more honestly identified as Western expansion. It was the doctrine of discovery that I was just recently talking about with the Apache Nation in Arizona. It stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered. Claimed, exploited by Christian rulers, and it declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion should be exalted, be everywhere increased and spread, and that the health of souls be cared for, and the barbarian nations be overthrown and brought to the faith. That's why down through the years, leaders of our religious bodies have had to challenge this doctrine of discovery, because it became the basis of all European claims in the Americas, as well as the foundation for the United States Western expansion. In U.S. Supreme Court, in an 1823 case, Johnson versus McIntosh, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote in his opinion on the unanimous decision that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to new worlds and new lands. In essence, American Indians had only the right of occupancy, which could be abolished. That meant white European settlers using military force as they moved westward to seize the land across the continent could establish networks of forts and militarized communities where native communities once thrived. killing all those who stood in their way. Whole communities, entire nations were forced off their land on long treks like the Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands died. And that's why a few months ago, in Arizona, we had a meeting with the Apache and the Pueblo and the Navajo people, and they asked one thing of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. They said, when we come to DC, that we would get a copy of the Doctrine of Discovery of Orange and burn it, because so much wrong was done in the name of it. From the beginning of this country, from the earliest wars, the Indian wars, racism was the key to U.S. wars and militarism. Wars were fought by us, the white European colonizer, against them, the other, who were demonized as less than human, as barbarians and savages. I mean, we were even taught that when we looked at Western shows. These are the savages. The multifaceted democracies of the various Indian confederacies were ignored. The multifaceted democracies of the various Indian confederacies were ignored. Indigenous people's complex integration of humanity with the rest of the living environment was dismissed. Manifest destiny of a continent-wide country required the extermination, or at least the removal and concentration of native populations outside of most of the lands they had inhabited for centuries, for millennia. The racism toward native people was not simply hatred of a people who were different from the European. It was key to the legitimization and the genocidal wars among ordinarily self-described so-called God-fearing people. In other words, the desire for the land came first, and then the justification of racism followed it. In June 1864, Civil War hero Colonel John M. Shivington led a Colorado militia against the black cattle land of Cheyenne and the Arapaho, the encampment at Sand Creek. You ought to watch the PBS special, Who is the Savage? And it describes how some regular Army officers protested to him, said, no, we can't attack these peaceable villages and peaceable people. Shivington ignored them and said, damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. He said, kill and scalp all of them, big and little. Nits make lice. Nits make lice. He ordered the attack. He not only was a colonel at that time, but he was a Methodist minister. We have to know this history in order to be exorcised from this history. Everything was militarized. The environment became a weapon as millions of buffalo were slaughtered so that native tribes on the plain, whose culture and indeed their survival was bound up with the survival of the buffalo, died of hunger and were forced off their land. Diseases common to Europeans became genocidal to the indigenous people, who were used as germ warfare, early weapons of mass destruction. Millions of native people died. In 1763, Lord Jeffrey Amherst proposed sending smallpox-infested blankets to native tribes around the same time. He called for measures to be taken that would bring about the total expiration of those Indian nations. Amherst is still the namesake of a lovely town in Massachusetts, even though he wanted to create death by blanket. Recently, I visited again the Apache Nation in Arizona, and I heard how the Apaches were forced onto this reservation down in a river basin. And I went there and could not stop crying uncontrollably. They were people who had lived in the hills. The Apaches lived up high. They were forced down in the river basin. And then the army at night opened up the river, flooded the river basin in an attempt to drown them all. And the people still suffer. The children still suffer with psychic trauma because they can only trace their families back so far. And today, even on those same lands, they still cannot own their own homes. They still live under war treaties. Today, And today, the current administration is trying to take that nation status. So you see, the use of military force, militarism, became not just an occasional necessity or an instrument of self-defense, but key to the ideological basis for legitimizing the United States power. United States settlers came from Europe for a host of reasons. Some were fleeing religious persecution. Others came in search of land and profit, a colonial enterprise. For some, it was both. Some came to do good, they said, and they did right pretty well. Militarism, though, was a big part of making that possible. And what this history shows us is still the case, that the effort to legitimize the U.S. role as a global superpower, to justify the constantly expanding search for oil and gas, for coltan, for our cell phones, and for access around the world for new military bases, for the expansion of U.S. military and economic power has been rooted in racism and militarism throughout history and throughout the history of this country. And it still remains key. And like so many things in our country, good and bad, the impact of militarism does not affect everyone equally. First Nations, the indigenous nations who once populated this land, were almost wiped out in the Indian Wars of the first 200 years of what would become the United States. Those who survived were legally forced onto reservations, small and inhospitable plots of land, mostly incapable of supporting healthy communities. Their culture, political systems, religious practices, systems of economic life were shattered. Those who survived kept the legacies alive, and movements to reclaim and rebuild those cultures and societies were rebuilt beginning in the 20th century. Powerful movements for land and water rights, for protection of Mother Earth, national culture, economic and social rights. And yet today, they still live under military treaties, today. And yet today, militarism continues to affect Native American communities, with military bases encroaching on native lands, with weapons testings, including nuclear testings carried out dangerously close to native lands, and multinational companies being allowed to drill on native land burial grounds that not only disrupts the burial ground, but poisons the water. And senators and legislators being complicit in this. A Washington State University study shows that the huge expansion of military bases in the 20th century was concentrated in the same area as Indian reservations, meaning that Native Americans faced disproportionate exposure to military dangers. The study said world wars and the Cold War pushed the United States to produce, test, deploy weapons of unprecedented toxicity, and Native Americans have been left exposed to the dangers of this toxicity. And that is why we must continue to have moral dissent and moral vision and moral resistance until we exorcise this demon of militarism from our national body. For African Americans, despite the fact that the first person to die fighting for the revolution of this country was an African American, Crispus Attucks. Well, the legacy of militarism goes all the way back to the first enslaved African Americans brought to the United States in the Middle Passage. The Second Amendment that you hear so many people fussing about, reference to state militias. Check it out sometime, state militias. That amendment was fought for mostly based on slave states demanding to preserve slave patrols. That's what it was. It's not about right to carry a gun. It was put in there as a right, because slave states said we want to have our slave patrols so that we can have guns anytime the slaves decide to revolt. It's not about hunting rifles. It was about slave masters having militias to put down slave revolts like the ones led by Denmark Vesey and others. And now the Second Amendment that was put there, listen, to make sure that slave masters had guns to kill black folk is being used to keep guns in the hands of everybody that's killing all of us. Isn't that something? It was through war and militarism that the institution of slavery was defended. As the Civil War raged, the wealthy slave-holding aristocrats made rules to send poor whites in the South to fight while their wealthy sons stayed home. And the Union Army only embraced black soldiers when they were losing, and then only in segregated and unfair ways. Notably, Lincoln, who sat on a pew in a church I first preached did part of this lecture in, He cites both North and South as recipients of this horrible penance, the war. Slavery was not simply the South's sin. Lincoln said it was America's sin. And the price America paid, said Lincoln, he said, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills, that it continue until all the wealth powered by the bondsman, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sung, and every drop of blood drawn with the last shall be paid by another's drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, Lincoln knew the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. America also watched it between 1870, after the Civil War, and the 1900s, when Africa faced European imperialist aggression and colonization and conquest. African societies tried to resist, but many were overrun. And by the early 20th century, much of Africa, except Ethiopia and Liberia, was colonized by European powers while America watched. The European imperialists pushed into Africa was motivated by three major factors: economic, political, and social. Walter Rodney wrote a powerful book. He was assassinated in the 1980s, but he wrote a powerful book entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So you cannot understand the world in which we live without understanding the demon of militarism. And in the 21st century, militarism continues, particularly having an impact on black communities and poor communities and brown communities. Militarism and war abroad has been matched by militarism of U.S. police and communities across this country for the last 50 years. When America has gone to war or bomb people, it has been against black and brown countries. Period. The militarization of the U.S. police, including programs through which the Pentagon donates leftover military equipment to local law enforcement, that was how we saw the horror of armed personnel carriers patrolling the streets of Ferguson's black community after the police killing of Mike Brown. And we know that young black men are 9 times more likely to be killed by the police than other people in this country. And police killing rates for Native Americans and Latinos are disproportionately high, and yet we're giving police departments more military firepower now than ever before. Not long ago, President Trump touted militarism in a speech at Dallas at the NRA. You may have seen it. And he brought up the history of Gonzales, which actually has an impact historically on both black and Latino people, or Gonzales. He said that the battle traces back to the beginning of the Texas Revolution, and he noted that the flag that they put up in the face of the Mexican army in Mexican territory was come and take it. But what he didn't teach the nation was the reason the settlers took their land, their stand there. It was because the white settlers in Mexico at that time, it wasn't Texas, it was Mexico, they wanted to keep their slaves. They wanted to remove Texas from Mexico because Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829. And it was still legal in the United States. Stephen F. Austin made it clear in 1824, the principal product that would elevate us from poverty is cotton, and we cannot do this without the slave. So Latino communities continued to suffer from the escalating militarism of the U.S. border because in reality, our Mexican brothers and sisters did not cross the border crossed them, and took from them what was theirs in the first place. And it was rooted in a desire to hold slaves. And now training Border Patrol agents in military tactics guarantees more casualties at the border, even before we get to the latest horror of what the White House has done by putting children in cages and snatching them from their parents. Poor white communities, however, also suffer from militarism, because they remain the largest source of drafted by poverty recruits to supposedly voluntary military. Garrett a scholar from Vet Voice Foundation described how he dropped out of high school after his father died of Agent Orange related cancer and ended up working small minimum wage jobs. He said, I bounced around a lot until I decided to join the military 1 month before September 11th. I was getting in trouble with law enforcement. I realized that I didn't have a lot of opportunities to go to college. I thought serving in the military, I would get that opportunities. Recruiters are in our high schools, sometime in our junior high schools, in our middle schools, recruiting kids all the time. This is somebody white talking. He said, you see them at the fairs and the other things where we see 8 and 10-year-olds being allowed to pick up weapons on tables and hold them and cock them and feel proud of them. That's what militarism looks like. That's what the poverty draft looks like. And of course, our country grounded in militarism goes to war. Western expansion in the United States didn't stop when it hit the California coast. It kept moving west across the ocean, and U.S. colonial moves into places like Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines and far beyond were the result. The wars the U.S. is fighting around the world today are not making us safer. They are fought for the same things that earlier wars were fought for: resources, military bases, expansion of power. They still don't keep our children safe. Our young people, mainly our poor young people, are drafted by poverty and the lack of other opportunities into a military to fight wars that cannot be won. And that means they are drafted into wars where they are fighting and killing other people just like them, just like us, halfway around the world. In 2009, already 8 years into war, the U.S. military admitted that there were only about 100 al-Qaeda fighters left in Afghanistan and another 300 in Pakistan, and that was the same year President Obama decided on troop surge in Afghanistan, adding almost 50,000 troops. The situation is worse than ever for Afghans now, and for the 15,000 plus U.S. troops still serving there, plus thousands more privately paid military contractors. There is still no chance of real victory because no one knows what victory looks like. What we do know is that the number of civilians killed in Afghanistan continues to climb. Thousands have been killed. Children, old folk, whole families. U.S. armed strikes have hit wedding parties and whole communities fall victims to our bomb. Does killing thousands of Afghan civilians make us safer? No. But this is what U.S. militarism too often has looked like. And what we know is this commitment to militarism and continuing wars has completely distorted our economy. So our economy is the wealthiest country in the history, is the only developed country. Then that's an interesting term, by the way, considering the way we keep going the world. But we are the only we are the only developed country that does not provide health care for all its people, and yet we're the wealthiest. In our country, the wealthiest country in the world, women are more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than any other developed country. More than 10 times in Poland. Here in Washington, D.C., in the capital of the wealthiest country in history, the death rate is the highest in the country, and it varies by race, with black women more than 3 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related causes than white women. Why? Not because we're a poor country. Not because we can't afford health care or first-class education or a good union job or living wages or infrastructure, but because our economy is first a war economy before it is an uplifting our people economy. Our country, we live in a country in which 53 cents of every discretionary federal dollar goes directly to the military. We might blame our debt on entitlement and welfare programs, but our debt is really based on all the bombs we've exploded in wars we should have never gone into. In our war economy, 53 cents, only 15 cents to help end poverty. And if this president has his way, by 2023, it'll be 65 cents, almost 2/3 of every dollar going to the military and only 12 cents to fight poverty. That's what has to change. And that's why we must have a nonviolent, moral direct action, moral vision, moral dissent, and moral resistance. This is why, because too long militarism has driven our history and who we are. We are not poor. The lie is that we don't have enough. We have enough. Scarcity is a lie. What we don't have enough of is the moral capacity to face this demon of militarism. We don't even have to raise taxes to do right. We don't even need more money. We need a different will, a different consciousness. We need to spend money differently than we're spending it. And we know that if we spend it differently, our country would be different. Just last year, Trump used 66 Tomahawk cruise missiles made by Raytheon and 19 joint air-to-air, air-to-surface standoff missiles, extended range from Lockheed Martin to attack a Syrian air base after a still unproven allegation of chemical weapon use. Those weapons cost $119 million. Now that doesn't sound like much compared to the over $700 billion Congress has budgeted for the military spending. And by the way, on this budgeting piece, when we have Republicans bragging on a budget deal that they did right by the military, and Democrats only bragging about they did right by the middle class, and nobody talking about who's done wrong by the poor, we really do have a problem. But $119 million could have made an enormous difference for the people at home. It could have paid for 11,000 veterans getting health care in Ohio. It could have paid for decent pay for 1,400 or more elementary school teachers in Kentucky. It could have paid for 2,141 good union jobs and safe water systems in Flint. Trump's increased military budget for the next year at $750 billion dwarfs the $543 billion cut by 9% allocated for education and student loans and affordable housing and community economic development, job training, the State Department, the EPA, renewable energy programs, and more. What will make us safer? A dangerous escalation in war across the world, or diplomacy abroad and a real war on poverty right here in America for jobs, health care, education? We've got to make the right choices. And around the globe, we see the effect of this intersection, as I prepare to close, on militarism and white supremacy. Today in 2019, we face a crushing and still rising global tide of nativism, xenophobia, white supremacy, reigning in the highest positions of power in Brazil and Hungary, and most especially here in the United States. Authoritarian leaders are legitimizing and emboldening violent racist movement that profoundly claim the mantle of white supremacy. In this country, they are terrorizing whole communities as they attack and kill African Americans in Charleston and Kentucky, anti-racist protesters in Charlottesville, Jews in Pittsburgh, Muslims in Queens, New York, to Oregon, California, to Kansas City, and beyond. And the recent killing of the more than 50 Muslims at prayer in Christchurch, New Zealand, by a white supremacist who called Trump a symbol of renewed white identity shows us just how shockingly the dramatic escalation of Islamophobia and white supremacy in power across the United States and beyond has spread to the world. We can see it in the $3.8 billion of our tax money that the United States sends directly to the Israel Defense Forces every year. Money that enables the military to continue its violations against Palestinian rights and gives Netanyahu, who continuously talks about war and warmongering, more strength. And to say this is not to dismiss the Holocaust, it is not to be anti-Semitic, because like the prophets in the Bible, they often criticized Israel when there was more trust in war than trust in the God of peace and justice. To say this, to criticize what's happening, is not to dismiss the tragic remembrance, and it is not to dismiss the legitimate enemies of the world and of Israel. But money can never be the basis of ignoring the lives of Palestinian children and ignoring the rights of Palestinian people. It just can't. We see Islamophobia and white supremacy at work when false charges of anti-Semitism are used to attack newly elected brave Muslim women, black, African, refugee, Palestinian women in Congress. And we know that those false claims are not only aimed at undermining our support for Palestinian rights, they are also a serious distraction to our crucial work of fighting against real murderous anti-Semitism that is on the rise around the country and around the world. When Netanyahu announces, as he did last week, that according to Israeli law, Israel is not a state of all its citizens. Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, and only it. We see racism at work. And we know that by funding and protecting this military and that state, we are complicit in that racism. We see moral complicity in the $3.8 billion of our tax money that the United States sends directly there that enables that military to continue its violation of Palestinian rights, not as I say, but as the UN says, the UN reports have recently said. We are approaching the one-year anniversary of the nonviolent protests in the besieged and hungry Gaza Strip known as the Great March of Return. During this year, according to the recent UN report, the report Special Committee, UN Special Report, the Israeli military may have shot and killed 183 Palestinian protesters, including journalists, medics, 32 of them children. More than 6,000 have been shot and seriously wounded, with scores having legs amputated. The UN called for the investigation of this. The investigation, and other rabbis around this country have called for it, many of them that I work with. And the military force relies on our tax money. And so this war economy, as others, some have to leave, has been around a long time. It's been around a long time. CEOs get something like $19 million a year, the average combat soldier less than 30. We have to change this focus on perpetual war. We have more people dying by suicide than are dying on the battlefield. And like this man, as I close, in the graveyard of Mark's gospel, the only way you can reconcile it is you got to name it. You've got to say what it is. You've got to deal with it and call it morally indefensible. That is why we need a national call for a moral revival. That is why we must face what we call the war economy. That is why we must demand that we have a right to protect our communities from the ravages of war and the weapons of war. What we need to be doing is putting more money in taking care of our veterans. What we need to be doing is taking more of our resources and lifting the poor and providing health care and stopping the privatization of the military budget. What we need is to end voter suppression that cuts out and undermines the people voting who most often get hurt by militarism. What we need is a ban on proliferation of guns in our community. What we need is not to militarize more our U.S. border, not to build walls between people, but to build bridges instead. What we need is to not tear up treaties that address issues like Islamophobia. Like this man in that story, we're in a low place. Militarism is a low place. It's a graveyard. Jesus came down to that man and lifted him up. The man was saved. The community was saved. His demonic possession by militarism was exorcised. My son, who's an environmental physicist, told me a story, Father, and I close here. He said, in environmental physicists, they are taught that when you look at geography and demographics, there's something out in nature called a snake line. He said, it's a certain height. If you can get high enough, snakes can't live because they asphyxiate, they're cold-blooded. He says snakes can only live below the snake line. Jesus had to go down to that graveyard and get that man above the graveyard, in other words, above the snake line. Today, we must realize as a nation, greed is below the snake line. Racism is below the snake line. Islamophobia is below the snake line. Homophobia is below the snake line. Militarizing our communities is below the snake line. Spending more and more money on militarism and war is below the snake line. And we must be the people that fight to take this country and this world to higher ground. Higher ground is where we build schools and not war. Higher ground is where we are more concerned about bread and butter than bombs and destruction. Higher ground is where we are more concerned about a guided conscience than guided missiles. Higher ground is where we are more concerned about saving life and educating children than exploding communities. Higher ground is where we are more concerned about treaties of peace than triggering war. Higher ground is where black and white and red and brown and Jewish and Muslim and Asian can form a beloved community instead of finding more ways to kill and destroy and oppress one another. Higher ground is what we must fight for. We must rise from the low grounds of militarism and war to the higher grounds of peace and justice for that is the only way that we shall ultimately live.